matter before the court is State of Ohio versus Johnnie Byrd. Each side will have 15 minutes, and the appellant will reserve up to 5 for rebuttal. I'll give you a hand signal when you get to 5, and then you'll know you have to stop.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. Ready to. Maybe I'll give you some extra time when I cough over you.
I don't think that will be necessary, Your Honor, but thank you. May it please the court, Attorney Angie Killey on behalf of the appellant, Johnnie Byrd. 2 assignments of error were raised in our brief, and primarily that was that all of the charges that were in the indictment and that Mr. Byrd was convicted of were supported with legally insufficient evidence or against the manifest weight of the evidence. The one that I would like to touch on today with the court is actually the conviction for theft in this matter. Under 29-1302, unless it is one of the specifically designated types of theft where money is not an issue, the state does have to prove the value of the money and or items that were stolen beyond a reasonable doubt. In this particular one, Mr. Byrd was convicted of a second-degree felony, which means that they had to prove a minimum of $750,000 up to $1.5 million for the actual product of theft beyond a reasonable doubt. The state did provide some testimony from an accountant, but it's speculative at best is our position. Mr. Fernandez, the accountant, reviewed the bank records in this matter and came up with EBT, or electronic benefit sales, in an amount of $1,442,940.59. Unfortunately, though, he wasn't able to offer any testimony as to how much of that money was a derivative of legitimate EBT sales. I know in the state's brief that they make mention of some of the comparables that were presented into evidence by the state during trial, and essentially proposed that deducting the comparable EBT sales from another business from this amount of EBT sales still gives you $1 million, and therefore that's sufficient. It's our position that that is not sufficient as a matter of law. In addition to the fact that there's also legitimate business expenses. There was no evidence presented as to what his rent would be, if he had any employees that he was paying, if he had tax obligations, if he had, obviously he was selling product that was legitimate out of this store as it was a functioning business and not just simply EBT transactions, so he had to stock merchandise. All of those type of business expenses are legitimate and not a theft. So I think that this particular conviction fails really as a matter of law because there's nothing other than speculation as to what the value is of the alleged theft. Just one simple number as to this is how many sales he transacted during this time frame is insufficient because there has to be some legitimate expenses out of that. And it's certainly the state's burden in order to be able to prove what was legitimate and what was illegitimate. And just because Mr. Byrd may have been a poor banker or a poor accountant doesn't necessarily mean that his actions could rise to that level of a felony to theft.
So he had no business records at all to indicate what he had purchased over the course of time or what he sold over the course of time? There's no evidence presented at all to show any of that?
Really, for the most part, the evidence that was presented was his bank. He had one bank account that was, my understanding, was in the name of the president of the corporation, one of the witnesses, Ms. Fry. Those are the records that were reviewed, and that bank account simply shows like in and outs. It doesn't indicate what everything, I mean, there was some that I know that there was allegations they were used for rent on properties outside, and that's where part of the money laundering charge comes into play.
Well, they had to purchase goods to sell.
Correct.
So
He has no records of any of that were presented.
So then there's no receipts for anything that he ever purchased to sell?
Not that I saw, Your Honor, unless I missed something, no. And it looks as though most of the time he was making cash withdrawals, so it's really difficult to determine what. I mean, there was certainly, I recall trial counsel questioning that there was product in the store. Even when they sent in the confidential informants to go in, they purchased small numbers of illegitimate items and legitimate items as well. So clearly he did have to spend money in order to keep the business up and running. and none of that was taken into consideration in regards to determining the value for the theft, which we feel is improper. I mean, even in regards to the EBT sales in and of themselves, and the state's witnesses testified that they don't have any way of determining or itemizing what was purchased with the EBT card. So if I were to go in to the Byrd house, in this case, and buy one beer, but $30 worth of groceries, it's simply gonna show a transaction for $30 and, 99 cents or whatever it is. It doesn't like, there's no designation as to what is legit and what is not legit. And their witnesses testified that that was the reality, that they cannot separate. So they really just took this entire amount of money that was transacted through EBT purchases and said, this is what was stolen.
You're almost at your 10-minute mark.
I'm sorry?
You're almost at your
Oh,
10-minute mark.
Okay. Actually, Your Honor, if nobody has any additional questions, I would rest on my brief. I think the rest of it's
I'll
outlined.
give you 5 minutes. You may want to do something after.
Just in case. Right, I appreciate that, thank you.
May it please the court, Helen DiMartino on behalf of the state of Ohio, we are asking that this court affirm Mr. Byrd's convictions for engaging in a pattern of corrupt activity, grand theft, telecommunications fraud, illegal use of food stamps, and money laundering. With regard to the theft conviction in this case, the records show that comparable stores had about $100,000 in sales, while this store had $1.4 million. So the numbers aren't close where you could say, well, maybe some of his legitimate stock or something was included. There was testimony from the accountant that the $930,000 that Mr. Byrd withdrew in cash, which doesn't include another $85,000 at the ATM, that his stock in the store wouldn't even equal the amount that he withdrew in cash. So the records, I believe when the court looks through them from the accountant and from the agents who testified with regard to the financials, they speak for themselves. This is not a case where there was no evidence presented as to what was going on in the Byrd house. We had 5 undercover buys as well as 2 witnesses who testified that they went into the store and they purchased things that are not permitted to be purchased with food stamps, such as alcohol, cigarettes. They also testified that in exchange for swiping their electronic benefit card for $400, they would get $200 in cash. So there was substantial evidence to support the fact that this income that the Byrd house had, which was vastly larger than any other comparable store in the area, was in fact obtaining money through the illegal use of food stamps, telecommunications fraud every time they swiped the EBT card, and was either allowing purchases for things that are not permitted and or giving customers twice the amount that was deducted from the card, then they would give that customer half of that amount. And this was a pattern of corrupt activity. The evidence linked Mr. Byrd to mortgage payments on his mother's house. His mother's house had a significant amount of cash inside of it, hidden in a suitcase in the garage, and dressers in the mattress. Cash that really couldn't be explained other than she said it was her husband's, but she also had testified to the amount of money that she had spent initially on these houses, which we could show there was at least $69,000 that went from Johnnie Byrd to his mother's mortgages. And if there are no,
How is that relevant?
that was how he was laundering the money.
Oh,
That was our
right.
theory of the case, was that he was laundering the money in part through the mortgage payments.
So when you're saying comparable sales from other businesses, you're talking about the volume of the merchandise that could have possibly been turned over from this store based on the brick and mortars and how many shelves are on with merchandise is in there. There's no way that they could have turned that over that fast and that much time to generate that account.
Correct. That's what the accountant testified to. And if there are no other questions, I would rest on the brief. Thank you, Your Honors.
Sure, sure.
Your Honor,
Okay. We'll take the case under advisement and send you a copy of the opinion on this, and you can also find it on the webpage. Thank you.
Thank
Have a good day.
Thank you, Your Honors.